and welcome to another episode of FooBar. Today we have a guest and we are going to talk about what is the role of a developer in the serverless ecosystem, in the cloud ecosystem, how it changed through time, and what kind of things you need to learn. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode. Today I have Jeremy Daly. He was one of the first guests I had on this. This is not a podcast before, even it was not a podcast. We met in Vegas a million years ago and he agreed. And now he's back. If you don't know Jeremy, he is the GM of Serverless Cloud at Serverless Inc. So he gets all the buzzwords in the title, and an AWS Serverless hero. And my favorite part, he's the host, how you call it, of the podcast Serverless Chat and the Off by None newsletter, where you can get all your serverless dishes in one go over the week. So after all that big introduction, how are you, Jeremy?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Marcia. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm super happy that you have time to come and chat with us about all the cool things you're doing at Serverless Inc.
Yeah, it's been crazy busy. So I've got, after the last year or so, I've been at Serverless now for almost a year, I guess 9 months or so. But I've got more gray in the beard, getting a little bit older, a little bit stressed out. A lot of work has gone into this. We got a great team, though, building some really interesting things and just pushing serverless forward, which has sort of been my mission for the last couple of years anyways. So this role fits me very nicely.
Yeah, I know. And I think the Serverless Inc. company is a great place to work. Austin is amazing. So have good colleagues there. So
yes,
lots
definitely.
of fun.
Definitely.
Yeah. And at the end, at the middle of this podcast, you are going to show what is the Serverless Cloud for the ones that are wondering what is this thing. So wait for it. But but first,
It's worth the wait. So stick around.
It is. So first, I want to chat a little bit with Jeremy because we always like to talk. And I think one interesting discussion that has been around is what is the role of developers? Like, we are expecting everyday developers to do 27 different million things, like from coffee to be a front-end developer, full stack developer, full stack cloud architect, I don't know, everything. So what you think, like, basic, without thinking of the cloud, without thinking of serverless, what a developer, what they should do?
Yeah, I mean, take the cloud out of it now. You go back to the basics, right? But
yeah.
I mean, I think over time,
dinosaurs roam
right?
the
Exactly.
streets.
Yeah, right. The old developers still working in Fortran. Not there's anything wrong with Fortran, but I think if you take the cloud out of it, right, then it's kind of hard to be a modern application developer if you're not thinking about the cloud. And I know, I mean, we interview people all the time. We talk to customers all the time. People who have not even forget about serverless. I mean, they haven't even touched the cloud yet. I mean, we got like a tiny fraction of people. I did a bunch of interviewing at a previous company I was at not too long ago, and the percentage of people graduating from college who had any cloud experience was very, very, very low. I mean, it was like, I uploaded something to an S3 bucket one time, or I used Firebase for this one thing that I did, and like something like that, whatever. And you're like, all right, well, that's not really cloud experience. I mean, you use like one cloud service, okay, that's fine. But it didn't get you into that. So, I mean, with any developer now, I mean, I like the idea of code camps and some of these other things that get people sort of up to speed. But I do think it needs to be said that the people who graduate from code camps, they could be very quick studies and they could learn a lot of things, and they understand for loops, and they can write a couple of data structures, or they understand some data structures and things like that. But being a programmer, being a developer, it takes a lot of time and energy to do that. And I think that, I don't want to say it's dangerous, but it can be one of those things where if you it's the things the things you don't know, and then the things you don't know. And I think that when you don't spend that time and have that experience of multiple years, there's a lot of things that you don't know. And those can open up a lot of problems when you start publishing to the cloud, even if you start publishing internally. I've got stories of when I was younger where I did things and I'm like, I didn't even know that was a possibility. So I think that's the big piece of it, is just you got to learn the basics. And you got to take time and you got to experience with them. And then I guess, I mean, I don't know if this is really the question, but I mean, I think also specialization you don't need to learn 15 different languages, right?
No.
You don't need to know Rust and Go and Python and JavaScript and TypeScript and all these other different languages. I mean, pick a couple. I mean, I think JavaScript is always a good one to start with anyways. Python is a good one to start with. It's a relatively easy language. The syntax is, relatively simple. Just a couple of things that will, especially ones that will work in the cloud, right? You know what I mean? Not that you can't run, C++ in the cloud. I mean, you can. I mean, but like there's like some of these other languages like a Python or a JavaScript think a place to start. But I guess my thought of being a developer is I don't think you're a developer if you're building anything. But adding that level of experience is really, really important because there are a lot of things that you're just not going to learn at a boot camp, and even in college, you know what I mean? There's a lot of things you're not going to learn. So you can graduate, get hired as a developer, and know a bunch of things, but then you still need to get that experience in the cloud. I mean, again, you said take the cloud out of it. I don't see how you can do that nowadays, but basically, I think you got to get that experience, and you've got to learn the cloud in order to be a developer in today's world.
Yeah, and I think it's like developing is a skill. So you can imagine it with knitting, with woodworking. Well, you can learn the basics. You can learn how to do the basic knits and go, I don't know, in English the names, one way, the other way. But then how to make a sweater
right? Yeah.
without following a tutorial,
right.
It's hard. Like taking the right measurements and making, I don't know if my audience knows how to knit, but I always try and I always fail. I can follow the tutorials, but when it gets me out from following a tutorial, I'm clueless. And that happens a lot with people that are learning technologies. They can follow the tutorials. They're very comfortable. They know how to navigate. But the moment you remove the tutorial, they're like, ah.
Right. Yeah, right.
So there is where experience comes into place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And how the cloud has changed. Like you said that you cannot take the cloud out of it, but I think it added quite a lot of more things because before
absolutely.
Developers, they were doing it in their computer and then passing the ball to ops, and that's it. I remember I have a teammate that even didn't care about what happened in QA before the cloud, that he was just like, I finished my work, hand up, and then it's QA problem, and from there, if there is a problem, report it, I will fix it, and maybe.
Yeah, right, yeah, and I think, the funny thing is the cloud has changed a lot, but I also think that there was a class of developers and a lot of developers well before the cloud existed that were that full stack developer, that were the person who would go ahead and install software on a server somewhere, or maybe they get a dedicated server, especially smaller startups or even just individuals. You might have had a hosting account back in the day, which I don't even know if they still do that, but basically, I have a hosting account at HostGator or something. I guess GoDaddy still does it, but I think there were a class of people who would just do that and just upload code and then be able to, run whatever it was, CGI bins and PHP and Ruby on Rails and some of these other things they were doing. Heroku obviously made some of that process a little bit easier. But then I think there was a class of developers who were still, rack them and stack them. Maybe they didn't do the physical hardware, but they rented it from somewhere, or they did do the physical hardware, put it in their own office. I know I had that for quite some time. I also had a data center that I would go to and rented a rack at a data center. So I think there's a class of developers, though, before all this cloud stuff existed, that was that full stack developer, or I don't even know what you call it, full stack engineer, full stack ops / dev, whatever the name of that is. But when the cloud comes along, it just made things a lot easier. Virtual machines, we were sort of at the advent of virtual machines when the cloud came to be, which I think is part of the reason why cloud was able to be done, was because virtualization and some of these other things that were the emerging technologies at that point. And then all of a sudden now you as a developer had access to dedicated machines that you could spin up very quickly, and it was super easy, and you could tear it down and spin it back up in seconds. Well, at that point it was maybe a minute or so, but essentially you could do that, and you could just experiment all you wanted to. I mean, when I first started using cloud, I installed SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server, directly on an EC2 instance, right? This was before RDS and some of these other things. But it worked great because I had no problem installing software, right? So it was easy enough to do. It was just a matter of getting it from your local machine or from the internet down to the EC2 instance and some of those things. So I think that piece didn't change much. What changed is when the cloud said, look, we've got all these different use cases that people need to do. They need a database. They need a queuing system. They need some sort of a event bus management. They need all these other things, a pub sub. And they said, let's build these specialized services that handle that for you, so that you don't have to go ahead and install RabbitMQ and some of these other things. Like, they'll just exist. Like, you got SNS and you got SQS and you got these other things. And I know SQS was a very early service, but I feel like getting distracted here, but that wasn't really like, at the time we weren't really thinking of SQS that way as sort of a managed service. It was just sort of a thing that they launched first because they needed it to do some internal stuff, and they said we might as well make this public. But I don't think as many people were using it. But anyways, the point is as you start specializing with these services, now every one of these services becomes a new thing to learn. So even though it does a whole bunch of stuff for you, and you don't have to worry about installing it, it's still a matter of knowing how to use RabbitMQ, right? Like, so even if you install it, RabbitMQ, that's fine, but you still need to know how to use it, what the pitfalls are, what the failover is like, or what the failure modes are, some of those other things. And that's what happened. And AWS goes along and they go ahead and they build 200 of these services, you know what I mean? So it gets even more complicated. But yeah, so I think that was one of the things that sort of shifted is now all of a sudden you go from, a developer being comfortable maybe with a couple of services like SQL Server. When I was younger and I had my web development company, we used SQL Server and we used Windows servers actually, IIS for a very, very long time. And that's what we ran. That was sort of our stack. And so I was very familiar with SQL Server and installing it was no problem. But then all of a sudden, now SQL Server goes away and it's like, well, I'm going to use RDS. Okay, well, what do I need to know about RDS? I knew how to do backups. I knew how to look at transaction logs. I knew how to do all that on my own server. Now suddenly that somebody else is doing that for me, and there's nuances, and then you've got VPCs and you've got security groups and you've got this whole other things. Like, I knew how to manage my VPN. Had a firewall, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but had a firewall that was configurable with failover and all these other things, and I knew how to manage that and set all those routes up. And then suddenly, now I got to think about, the security groups and all that kind of stuff. So there was a whole bunch of new things that kind of came up that you had to learn that really changed. I guess it's similar to learning SQL Server or these other things. But I think for a lot of people, even me, that was a big leap to sort of say, I'm now offloading this stuff to somebody else, but I still need to know how to use it. And it's just a new service that you have to learn that is different, by the way. It's not like I'm running SQL Server on Azure or I'm running it on AWS and I'm running it on Google or whatever. This is a new service that's similar to the service that I know, but it has its own nuances and its own limitations that I have to think about.
Yeah, and there are 200 of them.
Right, exactly. And you don't have to learn all of them. It'll scare people away. You don't have to learn all 200 services. I think 18 of them are named SageMaker somehow. So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's scary. I remember when I started with the cloud, it was on the serverless era that I started doing everything from not only from the Java application that I didn't care about the cloud, but from the serverless stack. And it was like, what is this Dynamo thing? How I configure it? How I have been using NoSQL database for a long time, but I never configure a NoSQL database. I know Dynamo doesn't have a lot of configuration,
right?
But as a developer, it was like, what? Okay, I need to configure a queue. What kind of queues? Okay, and what I do? What happens if it was permissions? Permissions?
Oh, permissions. Oh, right. Yeah, I know.
What are these permissions? Star all.
Right.
So I went through all that, and I think there again you have these two types, like the full stack developer that doesn't mind and goes through it and learns it all, and the one that's like, please help me out. I just want to code.
Yeah, well, no, I think that's part of the thing too. Is that if I'm a developer, I could be a developer in a massive corporation right now, and all I do all day is just write some Python scripts for automation or something like that, and that's all I do. I never think about the cloud. I never worry about HTTP or failover for different things. Like, all I do is write scripts for automation, or maybe I'm writing something internally. If you're a software developer and you're working for any number of software companies, they most likely have some sort of online component, I would hope. But I'm sure there's still software that is just being distributed via the internet that you install. You could be working for Microsoft and never touch anything to do with the cloud because you're just writing, updates to Microsoft Word or something like that. So I think there are plenty of roles where people aren't touching the cloud. And again, Traditional
fine.
development is not going away. So I mean, like I just think that as a developer now, if you're thinking about getting a job or you're becoming a developer or you're a developer now and you're working, in some place when you're just writing code, changing code for some accounting software or something like that, and you want to progress in your career, you got to start looking at the cloud, because the cloud is most definitely the future of where all the stuff is going.
Yeah, and then you have the different alternatives. No, we have things like CDK, that is all as code. That is, if you're a developer that might not want to get into learning YAML or things like that, you might find it easier. I don't know, if you still don't know what a security group is, it's still
Right.
hard. And then you have the other hand, things like Amplify, that you just put a command in a CLI and it throws everything in your face, and I think there are valid options. I don't know, what is your take on this low code, no code, or all code?
Well, no, I mean, right. I mean, there's a lot of different things there. I mean, I think you start with we're talking about the fundamentals earlier. I mean, the idea of fundamentals, I think, are important. Even if you're eventually deploying to some place that you're responsible for, understanding the fundamentals is important. And there's a lot of different ways to generate cloud infrastructure. You can start with the console, right? And you don't even have to touch infrastructure as code at all. Not a great idea for anything production, but if you want to play around with something and set up a DynamoDB table and play around with that, the console is a great place to go and do that. As you start to structure your application, you want to deploy these things. Then you start with something very basic like CloudFormation, right? Raw CloudFormation templates.
Basic.
Very well. No, I'm sorry. I meant very low level. Maybe is the right word for it. That it's very complex. There's a lot in there, and a lot that you're not going to understand. Most likely, there's still things in CloudFormation templates where I'm like, I don't know, it's in there. I'm just going to leave it because it probably makes sense.
Copy paste.
Right, exactly. So so the point is that you got this very, very low level implementation, right? And that is hard because you have to write all of that YAML. Then you go up to sort of the next level, which could be, even like the CDK. The CDK has a bunch of constructs for you, already pre-built things. I love the fact that you can build constructs and share them, and people can use those, and it'll spin up other things with all kinds. You don't have to think about rewriting the same code, but you're still thinking about, or you should still be thinking about, the primitives, right? Which is the Lambda functions that it spins up, or the EC2, if you're still doing that, or whatever. But if anything that you have to spin up, those primitives you need to know. And the same thing comes in when you're using the serverless framework, or you're using SAM, or you're using, even ARC codes. ARC codes is great because it really, really abstracts away a lot of stuff for you, and it gives you great developer experience. But you still have to say, I want to create a function, I want to create a table, I want to have these indexes on the table. There's a lot of things that you have to think about and understand how the individual primitives work. And while that's not, while you can probably just grab some template and kind of do it, right? And even though some of these other things sort of do things for you, when you're using SAM or serverless framework, it just spins up an API gateway. It's like you don't even know that an API gateway is spun up, even though it's actually there. So if you're not thinking about those things, then how do you deal with throttling? How do you deal with authentication? How do you deal with some of these other things that you need to know about? So I think when you start with those low level things, even jumping up to a slightly higher level abstraction like a serverless framework or SAM or ARC codes, you still have a lot of things you have to think about in terms of what actually gets deployed. When you move up to something like Amplify is great because it's like a couple of commands in the CLI, like you said, and then magically
you don't have a clue. You
don't have a clue what's happening unless you go and examine all of those.
Yeah, sure.
All of those different, the CloudFormation output, or you go and you look. The admin UI is amazing, and I like how you can go in and you can see all the different services that are deployed. But again, it's this fine line between sort of set it and forget it versus if I have a problem, how do I figure that out, right? So I think low code is great in the sense that it can get you where you need to go very quickly. But I also think that there's this issue where it could be too easy, right? And if the result of low code is the same as the result of you creating a raw CloudFormation template. The end result is the same, but you're still responsible for what gets deployed there. Not knowing what you're doing is probably not the greatest approach to some of those things. I don't think Amplify is bad at all. I think it's great for bootstrapping things. It's a great service.
And it depends on your use case. If you're building something that it's can't do everything with Amplify and you don't have any problem, that's great. The problem is when you start going to the edges and then you have this generated cloud formation and you're like,
right. And if you don't know anything that's happening there, I mean, again, I think it comes down a lot to responsibility. But I mean, so low code to me is where we're going. I don't think I hate no code. You look at something like Webflow or whatever. I mean, I don't want to badmouth Webflow. We're using Webflow actually at Serverless. We just launched our new site on Webflow. But it's you can do a lot of things with it, but it is a lot of point and click and whatever, and it's certainly not what a normal developer, or I don't know if say normal developer, but a developer who likes to code, it doesn't give you the ability to do that. Right. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, the thing is that I feel like you don't have as much control over your business logic and some of these other things, right? And that's what I like about low code solutions is at least, low code may abstract away the infrastructure and some of these other things, but at least it gives you control over your business logic, right? What you're actually doing there. So there's a good balance there between low code and full code. And I think it's okay to use low code as long as you understand a good portion of what's happening when you're going to be responsible for it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fights with Ben Kihoy and CDK. That nobody knows what is going on.
Right. Well, and I think Ben, Ben was on Serverless Chats a while ago, earlier this summer, and we talked about deterministic builds, and that idea where it's like every time you hit deploy, however you do that, CDK deploy, whatever you do, you want to make sure that if I run the code today and I run the code tomorrow and I don't change anything in that file, I want that to be the exact same every single time. I want to know that the code that I produce is going to be the same. With CDK, you can run loops, you can you can make a call to the internet, you can generate names, you could do all kinds of things that are really great features, except that means that the output, my CloudFormation template that gets generated, will be different every single time, and that's not something that you want to do. And I mean, even when you're doing deployment systems that are randomly naming resources, and then you have to have like service maps and some of these other things, like unless that's highly coordinated, it can get a little bit dangerous to not be able to kind of follow that path all the way through, and then your resources are different every time, and it's harder to debug. And then again, if you don't even know what the resources are that are being created, then it can get very frustrating and and dangerous. I'd say dangerous, but I say dangerous just because I think of security. I was in the data center days, so the hackers and the different viruses that you could, I forget the one there, the red alert virus or something like that, where you could attack an IIS machine and update the RAM. There's all kinds of weird things but I experienced all that, so I just became hypersensitive to security issues. So now that's all I think about.
It's a good practice,
right? Yeah, and I think, and speaking of the things you don't know, that's something that new developers don't think about. I had a developer, I don't know, maybe. He was 7 years into his career, and he wrote a bunch of code, and I was looking at it, and I'm like, this is completely wide open to SQL injection attacks, right? There's no control, right? And he was like, "What's a SQL injection attack?" And I was like, "Wow, okay." I mean, again, that's the thing, is I'm not sure everybody learns these things, and it depends on what your education is. And if you're not in the cloud or internet world building applications there, you might not know what a SQL injection attack is. And those can be very dangerous. I mean, people can wipe out tables with a SQL injection attack. So anyways, but yeah, I think that understanding so I went on my rant about security, but understanding what is happening behind the scenes, if you're using a tool that's generating all that for you, that you are then responsible for. Because again, there are low code solutions where you're not responsible for the infrastructure at all, and you don't have to worry about managing it, right? It's just part of whatever it is. That's actually one of the things that we're trying to do with Serverless Cloud. And then you've got other ones, there's Darklang, there's a couple of other ones that you just don't really have to worry about what's happening behind the scenes. But if you have to actually go and manage that DynamoDB table, or you have to go in and be able to manage and see the errors and all that kind of stuff that are happening in your Lambda functions and some of that stuff, that's a lot of responsibility to take on.
Yeah, it will be like if we have to run our own Lambda functions and be responsible for the EC2 machines. And you want to know
right,
how those
right.
serverless magic is cooking. Now, because we don't have to manage those Lambda functions, we just trust that it works.
Right, yep.
And one thing you mentioned quite a lot of times now during this ranting, it was primitives and functions and basic concepts. So what are kind of important things that developers need to know when they are learning the cloud? Like, what are they some important primitives, or they just should focus on architecture patterns and design and forget about all the specifics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what type of role you want. I think if you're more ops-minded, and you're thinking more about, managing cloud accounts and maintaining security and compliance and things like that. Just, you want to make sure that your cloud accounts are all tidy and that you can, have multiple accounts for different developers or different stages, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot to learn there, right? I mean, you can start at the very top with just understanding VPCs and security groups. IAM, right? So the idea of all of the identity access management, that in and of itself, if you became an expert in identity and access management in AWS, you would never run short of consulting jobs because it is very, very, very complex. I think I saw Bridget Johnson speak at Reinforce, the first Reinforce in Boston, and she was going over all these things about, like assuming identities and using tags and all this guy, and I'm like, role based. I'm like, this is so far. I mean, like I'm beyond the star, just saying like, whatever, like Dynamo tables colon star, but like, but all the details of all those other things. So anyways, if you're a security-minded person, would be a great thing to learn. But anyways, so there's a couple of top-level services like that. And then, again, if you're that ops-minded person, understanding the security groups and IAM, like I said, but then also some of the governance tools that are there, even like understand like the WAF configuration and some of those other things. There's all the ones that like what I'm trying to, of course, I'm drawing a blank on some of these names, but Access Manager, I think, is one of them. And some of these other things that like, can detect if there's issues and some of that stuff and being able to do that. So there's a bunch of those services that you certainly could do at that higher level. But if you're not at that level and you're just a developer, I still think you need to go and you need to learn some of these primitives because you need to understand some of the nuances of them. It's not just throw the code over the wall, let the ops people handle it. And you're going to see, if you're working in a cloud team, more and more organizations basically putting the developers on call, right? The developers being responsible for their own code, which is kind of the way that it should be, right? It's hard for somebody who doesn't know your code to debug it sometimes. So it's easier if you know the code and you're in the moment and you have that fast feedback cycle. So if you're a developer that is looking for, just sort of learning some of the basic primitives, I would start with Lambda, because Lambda is such an easy way to just run code. I mean, even if you're just uploading directly to Lambda and you're just triggering it from, I don't know, whatever. I mean, you can trigger it from API Gateway and some of these other things, but just triggering it off for an event or off of a data stream or some of these things, like there's so many things you can do. Just schedule it, run it every 5 minutes and have it update some API. Or I mean, you can do so many things with it. So Lambda is obviously a great one. If you're doing anything with the web, right? If you're dealing with APIs or websites or anything like that, you need to know API Gateway. API Gateway, HTTP APIs are great. They're super cheap now and they're super fast. More complex, you can learn the REST API side of things and some of that. I still think that the main services that I run on almost every app that I've ever built are SNS and SQS, right? So SNS is the pub sub service, SQS is the queuing service. And then you can get deeper. I mean, DynamoDB is a great thing to use, even if you're just storing a couple of things here and there, and you just need to make some minor updates. I mean, it's all transactional, or it's more for transactional processing. So you can't run complex queries on it where you're doing analysis of sums and aggregations. That's all something that is more complicated to do with DynamoDB. But learning the basics of Dynamo, I think, are super helpful. Yeah. And then S3. I mean, S3 is a very, very complex service. I think somebody, I don't remember who told me, but like this was years ago, that like there's like 208 microservices that power S3.
There might be more now.
Might be 500 at this point. with all the different storage modes and things like that, but also understanding the security and whether how you can make public buckets or how not to make public buckets. Some of that stuff.
S3 is a great example of a primitive that is very important to know, but it's so massive that you don't need to know all the nuances.
Right. Yes. Right. Like you don't need to know glacier storage and things like that.
Or even the regional replication and how all the different storage classes work and how the global accelerator. Sure, the more you add to it, the more like power you will have. But I think that's one of the scary things when people start learning something, that they want to learn it from all the angles, and usually these big AWS services can do so many things.
Right, yeah. I mean, well, S3 alone, besides just the storage aspect of S3, you've got S3 Select, where you can actually like scan through files. You can kind of use it as a database. It's actually really efficient to do certain things that way. And then so many services integrate with it, so you can write to it from like Kinesis Data Firehose, and you can automatically, and now they just added this cool thing where you can add prefixes that are dynamic. So like based off of the data in the packet that you're sending via, Kinesis, you can route it to a different file in there. And so there's a lot of really cool things you can do at S3. You can trigger events off of S3 and hit Lambda, right? You can, you can access event bridge. There's all kinds of crazy things that you can do. But yeah, S3, you're right. That would be an interesting series. Like the only things you need to know about S3, or like, just something that's like, that just shows you just need to get started with some of these services. You don't have to go as deep. But I think S3 is a great example. Like you said, it's a service that you don't have to learn fully. You just need to learn some of the basics. What those basics are, again, probably change every day, right? But if you can find...
And I think it depends what you need to do, because if you're going to use the event-based part of it, maybe you need to know how to trigger Lambda functions. But if you just want to store your website, you might want to learn how to secure that. So it's super vast. But I think S3 is one of those things that you need to at least know that it exists. It's like CloudWatch. And the other day I was talking with one lady, and she didn't know that there was a monitoring tool inside AWS, and she created a Lambda function that was sending messages to Slack to see the logs.
Oh, geez.
It's like...
Yeah. Well, I think that's easy to do. I mean, that's the problem, right? That's the problem with primitives. And like you said, I didn't even mention CloudWatch. Yeah, CloudWatch, you need to know CloudWatch. It's how you know what is happening.
But we never thought that you need to know that.
Right. Well, and then the other thing is I mentioned two different types of API gateways, API HTTP gateways and API REST, or API gateway REST APIs, whatever it is, right? However the wonderful naming of AWS services.
System manager.
Right. So that's right. So those are two ways to access a Lambda function or other services via an API. But you also have AppSync, right? So if you're doing GraphQL things, then you have AppSync, and then you have two different ways you can do WebSockets. So you can do WebSockets with API Gateway REST APIs, and you can also do WebSockets with AppSync, and you can also do it with another IoT service that's there. Like, so there's a bunch of different ways that you can do those things, and I think it gets very confusing too to new developers. Like, because I know so many people who are like, we're running GraphQL on AWS, and we're running it on Lambda, and they just install Apollo or whatever, right, like on their Lambda function, and they're doing it all with one single Lambda function. It's fine, works great, but there's a whole other service dedicated to GraphQL that is much more efficient and can do so many more things that if you want to do GraphQL, then look at AppSync, right? So you've got those things there. But I mean, so I would say though that those I probably missed a couple in there, but those are the primitives.
You missed two. They're very important ones.
All right,
step functions and event.
I was going to get to event bridge, but yes, step functions is another thing, right? But the point that I'm sort of making here is all of those primitives there's a lot there, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you don't have to go deep on all of them, but you do need to be aware of them because they're going to come into your architectures when you start building these modern apps. And modern apps, I mean, that's the thing, is like, how do you define a modern application? Oh, maybe it runs in the cloud, whatever. I think event-driven is sort of this idea where this is the modern application that we're building now. And there's two services that are super important when it comes to events, because there's two ways to sort of manage microservice communications and how applications flow. One is what's called choreography, and the other one is called orchestration. Choreography is this idea that, the systems aren't connected, but they all, they can sort of observe one another and kind of, dance together, right? So when
they listen to the music.
You listen to the music and dance, right? So that has to do with generating events, and those events just kind of go out there, and other services are listening for those events. EventBridge, amazing service for that. It's so cool what has happened with EventBridge. It started as like this, just a couple events flying back and forth, and suddenly became like this. It's like an absolute staple, I think, in most applications now. So EventBridge just allows you to send events and subscribe to them with multiple services and trigger other things, and you don't need to use Lambda in a lot of cases, so it's great. So that's the idea of choreography and being able to share messages. But you can't guarantee necessarily that a particular service is going to get that, right? So, if it's something like, I'm going to send a marketing email when somebody signs up for a new account. Okay, great. You sign up for a new account, that generates an event that says new account created, and that goes, and then you've got a bunch of services listening to it.Maybe you got a bot that picks it up that sends it to Slack. Maybe you get a bot that picks it up that sends an email via HubSpot or something like that. And I think that's a perfectly valid way to build applications, and is something that you can use, I think, a majority of the time. But then you have very specific sets of events that have to happen, and you need to know that this event happens, and an ordered event, right? And so that's where orchestration comes in. And AWS has an amazing service for this, which is step functions, as you mentioned. And this is the service that allows you to basically say, I want A to happen, and then I want B to happen, and then if B fails, I want you to do this, but if it succeeds, then do this. And then if all these fail, then I need you to roll all these things back. And it's so powerful, so many cool things you can do with it. And there's a couple different flavors of it. You've got the express version versus the sort of the full version. And then you also can do things like synchronous calls now through it, if you're using HTTP APIs. I'm getting overly complicated. I hope people's eyes.
I have a whole
over.
playlist on that, so I'll link it in the description.
Perfect. Yeah, watch all of Marcia's videos, because I know you have a ton. You have a ton of stuff.
I love step functions.
Yeah, step functions are amazing, right?
I love them.
Right. But so that's the idea. So this is what I would say, is that you got a bunch of primitives that you're probably going to need in order to build most of what you build, and then you really have to think about these two services that are really the connective glue of any larger application. Having those two things there that can control the way that events flow through your application. And it's not easy. I mean, again, none of this is easy. This takes a lot of time. So going back to the earlier discussion of what it is to be a developer, like, if you get out of boot camp and you are immediately thrown into something like this, it's hard. This is stuff that is going to go beyond,
and you might not appreciate the service because you might not have the right explanation or the right exposure. I remember when I was in my previous life, we were in a big customer, and AWS, we were one of the top customers in Finland, so they were coming to us all the time with new announcements. And one of them was Lambda, and they have all the developers there. They were trying to get us to use Lambda, and I was like, why they sit me here? I'm a developer. I don't care about Lambda. I don't understand. Yes, it was Lambda. Didn't have any integration into API Gateway. I didn't relate how it could help me. And I spent like 8 months of Lambda lives without caring about it until one day they hook it to an API Gateway, and my lamp was like, oh.
Right. All of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it now. Right.
So that happens with so many services or things that you don't see how you can use it, so you discard them and move on. So I think it's very important not to deep dive with these things, but to have an idea of what is going on. So whenever you're building something, you can say, I heard about a service that does manage GraphQL. Let's see.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think so part of that too is, I think you're right. Dismissing services is super easy. Like, honestly, I've done a little bit with machine learning in the past, but I always kind of did it with using APIs. Like, we used to use Watson at a previous startup I was at, and we used a couple of other services like Google. I forget the Google one, but like now we have API, or we have recognition, and we have comprehend, and some of these other ones that are built into AWS, which are great because you don't have to think about getting into the whole SageMaker thing. Honestly, I don't have time or energy to get into the SageMaker stuff, right? I still haven't. I know we got the Heroes got those free keyboards 2 years ago or whatever it was at reInvent. I haven't even taken mine out of the box. Like, I didn't even have time to play. Like, and so
mine is behind there.
You have okay. But like, so it's funny because you can easily ignore those things, and it's just like maybe that doesn't make sense to me. I would suggest anytime a new AWS service comes out, though, just at least read Jeff Barr's blog post on it just to get the overview and see if it's
mine
anywhere
blog post. I
write actually Marcy's blog post as well, right? Just to get that overview of it, because I think that if you do that, then there might be a way that it fits in. But here's what the crazy thing is every time there are incremental improvements. This is the other great thing about, again, building in the cloud, where it's like, just services just get better over time. Things get faster. Things get quicker. They add new features so that you can remove code from your own, from your own code base. Because this is a talk I gave a while back called like how to fail with serverless, which basically talked about all the different modes of failure and all the things built into the cloud that allow you to retry events or put them into dead letter queues, or what the retry mechanisms are and things like that. And these are all things that are built into the cloud. And normally you'd have to write this into your code to have all these failovers and retries and things like that. You don't have to do a lot of that anymore. It's like, hey, if my Lambda function fails, I don't have to write a whole bunch of error logic to try to like capture it and log it and do some of these other things. Just let it fail and then configure the service so that it captures that correctly and either sends it to a DLQ or triggers something else. I mean, the crazy thing is, like, you can have, like, if you have a Lambda function that fails because of some random thing, whatever it is, I don't know, I'm making things up here, but it fails because of some random thing, you can have that go ahead and write to a DLQ, which is a dead letter queue, which is just a queue, or you can have it go to EventBridge, or you can have it go to SNS. Like, there's a bunch of different places you have to go to. But then that can trigger something else. I mean, that could send an email. That could hit a Slack bot. That could trigger a bunch of other services to follow up with the user.
Another Lambda function.
When hit another Lambda function. Yeah, I mean, it's all. This is how the system works. It's all event driven. It's all event driven, and like even the API gateway thing. Like, as soon as API gateway was added to Lambda, because I saw Lambda early as well, and I was like, what's this preview thing? But once API gateway was added, then it was like, oh, now I get it, right? So powerful. It's just an event. Your HTTP request, right, is just an event that gets posted, or gets sent to a Lambda function, and then that Lambda function can respond synchronously. And then this is the other thing with events, asynchronous. This is another thing that I think so many developers just don't understand, because they've not been in an environment where async was a thing. Like, you think about multi-threading and some of these other things that happen.
There is where front-end developers are easier to convert sometimes to event-driven architectures.
Because of JavaScript, absolutely.
My husband is a front-end developer, and he's been talking about event-driven applications since the dinosaurs time. And for me, it was something that I started doing when I was into serverless. And he was like, sure, obviously, that's the only way to make applications. I was like, okay.
Yeah, well, because a lot of these frameworks were built off of this idea of events, right? Exactly. And so you're firing events back and forth, so that makes a lot of sense. And again, JavaScript developers, people that are building on React or Vue or any of these things, a lot of them understand asynchronous applications, right? The fact that they can have things kind of run and then come back afterwards, and you can run multiple things. It's non-blocking, right? So that's a really interesting thing that you can do on front end code. Well, with the cloud, it's not that you can't do it on the back end code. You can run multiple threads and things like that, but it's just you're thinking. That's a lot of low level thinking there. But with serverless and with cloud services, you can literally just run an async application. So you say, oh, I want to trigger this Lambda, and when it finishes, do something, but that can be completely disconnected from your critical path or whatever it is, so it's non-blocking. So I can go ahead and trigger a bunch of Lambda functions or send a bunch of events and do all these things that'll get processed later, and usually by later it's pretty much instantaneously, but those will get processed later, but it doesn't block that main thread. So an API call can go ahead and trigger a million different things, and it's super easy for me to be able to do that. So that's another way of thinking about it too that always, I think, trips people up.
Yeah, I think there are these two parts, the primitives of the cloud, learn the abstract, what they do, what more or less the basic services do, and then some architectural patterns, orchestration, choreography, asynchronous development, event-driven architectures. And with that, you might be in the kind of way of understanding what is going on.
Right.
So I think now we have been doing this for 40 minutes, and I want to show you... I want to talk about what you have built in Serverless Inc. This is all for today. I hope you like this video. If you want to get in touch with Jeremy or get access to this Serverless Cloud service, The links are in the description box. Let me know in the comments what you think is the role of developers nowadays. What you think about this topic. Is it something that is interesting for you? And I'll see you next week with another episode of FooBar. Ciao, ciao!